The night my sister blocked the entrance of my own hotel, she didn't just stop me at the door. She stopped the version of me my family had spent years pretending was real. The glass doors were glowing under soft golden light, reflecting champagne flutes and silhouettes dressed in confidence. Laughter spilled onto the sidewalk like it belonged there. My sister stood right in the center of it all, heels planted, chin lifted, smiling the kind of smile you give someone you're about to humiliate. She laughed loud enough for the valet to hear and said I couldn't afford to step inside. My father nodded beside her, arms crossed as if this was obvious. My mother leaned close and whispered that I shouldn't embarrass the family on my sister's birthday. None of them knew the building behind those doors existed because of me. They didn't know I'd signed every document that made the lights turn on. They didn't know the staff inside answered to my standards, my systems, my name. And when my head of security began walking toward the entrance, calm and deliberate, I realized something I'd avoided admitting for years. Family blindness comes at a heavy price. If you've ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to see you, I want you to stay with me. And before I tell you how this night unfolded, where it ended, and what it cost all of us, take a second to let me know you're here. Comment where you're listening from, or just say hi. Stories like this don't get told loudly, and staying connected helps keep them from disappearing. Now let me tell you how it started. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was 32 years old that night, and I had learned long ago how to stand still when people tried to shrink me. The invitation to my sister Lila's birthday party had arrived that morning, short and practical, the way my mother liked to phrase things when she wanted control without confrontation. The party was at a luxury hotel downtown, the kind of place she liked to name drop. The message ended with a reminder not to be late and a suggestion about dressing appropriately. Nothing about me felt welcome in it, but nothing ever did. What she didn't say was that they'd chosen that hotel because they thought it symbolized success, because they believed it proved something about our family, because to them buildings like that belonged to other people. People who looked right. People who chose respectable paths. 10 years earlier, I'd walked away from the career my father approved of. I chose hospitality, service, operations, systems. The word service still tasted like failure to him. To me, it meant excellence done quietly, consistently, without applause. It meant learning how people move, how spaces breathe, how trust is built without ever being announced. They never asked what I was building. They decided what my choice meant and called it truth. By the time the sun started dropping behind the skyline, the city looked polished for the evening. I stood across the street from the entrance and watched guests arrive. Couples stepped out of black cars like they belonged there. Laughter floated through the air. Staff moved with practiced calm. Everything was exactly how I'd designed it to be. I didn't walk in yet. I watched my family first. Lila was radiant in the way only someone who's never been questioned can be. She stood near the doors like they were hers. My father hovered close, proud, protective. My mother floated in and out of conversations, smoothing edges, managing impressions, already playing host in a building she believed impressed people because of its name, not its ownership. I felt the familiar weight settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. This wasn't just a party. It was a performance, and I wasn't meant to be part of the cast. I checked my phone once. No messages, no missed calls. They had already decided how the night would go. I slipped the phone back into my bag and adjusted my jacket. Not because I was nervous, but because there are moments when you feel something irreversible approaching and your body needs a small ritual to stay steady. I crossed the street and walked toward the entrance. Lila saw me before I reached the curb. Her smile shifted, sharpened. She stepped forward, planting herself directly in front of the glass doors. My father's posture stiffened beside her. My mother's eyes flicked around, already calculating who might be watching. "You can't come in," Lila said, laughing. "This isn't your kind of place." I looked at her, then at the doors behind her. The same doors I'd walked through 1,000 times without anyone noticing. My father cleared his throat. "This is a private event," he said. "Don't make this difficult." My mother leaned in close, her perfume familiar and sharp. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this here. People are watching." I wanted to tell her that people were always watching. That was the whole point of places like this. But I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't pull out proof. I stood there quietly letting their words exist in the open. Because silence has a way of exposing what noise tries to hide. Behind the glass I saw movement, a familiar shape, a man in a dark suit walking with purpose. My head of security. Daniel, his stride, steady eyes scanning the scene with the calm attention of someone trained to notice patterns, not emotions. My sister laughed again, louder this time. "See," she said, "you don't belong here." I met her gaze, then glanced past her shoulder as Daniel stepped closer to the doors from inside. The reflection in the glass caught my own face, composed, unreadable. Not defiant, not wounded, just present. That was the moment I understood this night wasn't going to end the way any of them expected. And if you think you know how stories like this go, stay with me. Because what happened next didn't involve yelling or revenge or a dramatic speech. It involved systems doing exactly what they were built to do, and truth walking in without asking permission. If this already feels familiar, if you've ever been told you didn't belong in a room you worked your way into, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this unfold quietly, and the next part is where everything starts to shift. I didn't step back when my sister laughed. I didn't step forward either. I stayed exactly where I was, close enough to the door that the warmth from inside pressed against the glass, close enough that every word she said had an audience. Lila shifted her weight and glanced around, checking who was watching. Her voice changed after that. It always did. Louder, sharper, more certain. "This is a private event," she repeated, as if saying it twice turned it into policy. "Staff has instructions." That was new. My father nodded immediately. Richard had always believed authority lived in tone. If you sounded like you belonged, people moved out of your way. "We told them to keep things controlled tonight," he said. "It's her birthday." My mother didn't look at me at all. Margaret's eyes stayed on the entrance, tracking reflections, scanning faces. "This just isn't the time," she said softly. "We're trying to keep the evening smooth." I watched her hands. They were folded too tightly in front of her fingers, pressing into each other. That was how I knew this wasn't spontaneous. That was how I knew something had already been decided. Inside the lobby, staff moved differently now. I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure. A concierge paused mid-step. Someone at the front desk glanced down at a tablet and then back up again, careful not to meet my eyes. The flow I'd built into the space was still there, but it was constrained, guided by instructions that didn't belong. I could have ended it right there. I could have pulled the keycard from my bag. I could have said my name. I could have watched the color drain from their faces and felt that sharp, satisfying reversal everyone expects in stories like this. But I didn't, because that kind of truth turns into an argument, and arguments let people pretend there are two sides. I wanted clarity. Lila took a step closer to the door, her back almost touching the glass now. She'd turned herself into a barrier, shoulders squared, chin lifted. "You're making this awkward," she said. "Why would you even show up here?" I met her gaze. "It's your birthday," I said. "That was all," she scoffed. "You don't belong in places like this," she said louder again. "Everyone knows that." Behind her, a staff member approached from inside, stopping just short of the door. He looked young, new. His eyes flicked between Lila and my father, then passed them to me. Uncertainty tightened his posture. "This is a family matter," my father said to him, authoritative, practiced. "We've handled it." The staff member hesitated. That hesitation mattered. In this building, hesitation was data. My mother leaned toward him, her voice low and calming. "We've already spoken with management," she said. "Everything's approved." Approved. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger. Recognition. That word wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The staff member nodded slowly and stepped back inside. The door didn't open. I stayed where I was and watched as my sister exhaled in relief. Her shoulders dropped just slightly, like she'd won something. She turned to my mother with a quick smile, the kind that said, "See, it's handled." Inside, Naomi stood behind the front desk. She didn't look up right away. Her fingers moved across the tablet in front of her, precise, unhurried. I'd hired her 3 years earlier because she never reacted emotionally. She observed first. She logged everything. Daniel shifted position a few feet behind the entrance, closer now. His presence subtle but deliberate. He didn't intervene. He didn't ask questions. He watched. I thought about the first time my family had dismissed what I was building. 10 years ago, sitting at a dining table that still smelled like coffee and toast, my father telling me service was beneath me. My mother looking at me like I'd announced an inconvenience instead of a career. Lila smirking, already certain she'd chosen better. They'd never seen the work. They'd never asked. They decided who I was and called it truth. Lila turned back to me, confidence restored. "You should just go," she said. "We'll tell Dad you couldn't make it." "I'm right here," I said. She rolled her eyes. "You know what I mean." Yes, I did. A couple stepped out of a black car behind me, pausing awkwardly when they realized the entrance was blocked. Lila shifted to the side just enough to let them pass, smiling brightly, hostess again. "Happy birthday to me," she said lightly, like the moment before hadn't existed. They disappeared inside. My father lowered his voice. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Why can't you just let one night be about your sister?" I looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even cruel. He was embarrassed. He was afraid of what my presence might suggest. Afraid of a story changing. "I'm not doing anything," I said. My mother glanced toward the lobby again, then back at me, frustration breaking through her composure. "You always do this," she whispered. "You make things uncomfortable." I almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, I felt something colder, cleaner. Inside, Naomi finished typing and set the tablet down. She looked up, then directly at me. Just for a second. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes acknowledged me. Not as a problem, as a fact. Lila didn't see it. She was too busy enjoying her control. "See," she said to my parents. "Handled." Daniel took one more step closer to the door from inside. He didn't open it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone changed the temperature. I realized then that my family believed they were keeping me out. What they were actually doing was leaving a record. The night stretched thick and tense. Guests continued to arrive. Each time the door opened for someone else, it closed again in front of me. Each time my sister repositioned herself, more confident, more entitled. Each time my parents reinforced her, their words smoothing over what their actions exposed. I stayed silent, because silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was structure. And as the minutes passed, I could feel the system waking up around them. Not angry, not offended, just alert. They thought they were controlling the entrance. They had no idea they'd already crossed a line they couldn't step back over. The city kept moving like nothing was wrong. Cars rolled past the curb in steady lines, headlights washing the pavement in pale white arcs. Music drifted faintly from inside the hotel whenever the doors opened for someone else. Laughter rose and fell, light and careless. If anyone looked too closely, they might have thought I was just waiting for a ride. I wasn't. I was watching patterns. My sister had settled into her role completely now. Lila stood just off-center of the entrance, close enough to intercept anyone she wanted, far enough back to look like she belonged there. She laughed with arriving guests, accepted compliments, posed for quick photos. Every few minutes she glanced at me the way you check on a problem you believe is already solved. My father stayed beside her chest out, hands clasped behind his back. He spoke to people he recognized, nodded to people he didn't, playing the part of proud parent in a place he thought validated him. He didn't look at me anymore. That was his way of winning. My mother moved constantly. Margaret drifted between small groups, touching arms, leaning in, whispering. She was smoothing the air, preemptively shaping the story. I caught fragments as she passed close enough. She's sensitive. She didn't understand the invitation. She gets ideas sometimes. Each sentence landed quietly, designed to soften whatever version of events might follow. Inside the lobby, lights shifted slightly as evening settled. Staff rotated positions with subtle precision. The front desk was calm, but I could see the undercurrent now. Naomi's tablet never left her hands. She didn't stare at the door, but she didn't stop tracking it either. Every interaction near the entrance passed through her peripheral vision. Daniel had positioned himself a few steps behind the interior threshold, angled so he could see both the doors and the desk. His presence wasn't aggressive. It was anticipatory, like someone who knew something would need attention soon. I felt oddly detached from my own body, as if I were observing the night from just behind my eyes. This was the space I'd learned to live in years ago, when disappointment became predictable, when staying calm was the only way to remain intact. My phone vibrated once in my bag. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. Whatever it was could wait. This couldn't. A pair of women approached the entrance, dressed in tailored black, their confidence unmistakable. Lila stepped forward immediately, smile bright. "Welcome," she said, gesturing them inside. Then, as an afterthought, she added, "Private event upstairs." They nodded, impressed, and disappeared into the lobby. As the doors swung shut again, I noticed the staff member from earlier glance at Naomi. He said something quietly too low for me to hear. Naomi listened without interrupting, then tapped her tablet once. Just once. That small movement sent a chill through me. I thought about the first building I'd ever managed. A modest property, barely profitable, full of problems no one else wanted. I'd learned early that buildings tell you when something's wrong long before people do. A change in sound, a change in flow, a pause where there shouldn't be one. This building was telling me something. Lila turned to me again, irritation creeping into her expression. "Why are you still standing there?" she asked. "Do you want people to think something's wrong?" I held her gaze. "Is something wrong?" she scoffed. "Don't do this." My father stepped closer to her, his voice low but firm. "You've made your point," he said to me. "Go home." "Home," I repeated quietly. My mother finally looked at me then. Really looked. There was a flash of something behind her eyes I couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "This isn't appropriate," she said. "We talked to the hotel. They understand. Understand what I almost asked. Almost." Instead, I watched as Daniel spoke briefly into his earpiece, then let his hand drop back to his side. His face didn't change, but the air did. Two guests paused just inside the lobby, glancing toward the entrance with curiosity. One of them leaned slightly, trying to see past Lila. She noticed and adjusted her stance, blocking the view of me more deliberately now. That was the moment I realized they weren't just trying to keep me out. They were trying to erase me. Not emotionally, procedurally. If I was just an inconvenience, they could explain it away. But if I was unstable, inappropriate, disruptive, then my exclusion became reasonable. Necessary, even. They were laying groundwork. Quietly. Efficiently. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with a kind of clarity that burned cold. I thought about the years I'd spent building systems that didn't rely on trust alone. Systems that assumed people would overstep if given the chance. Systems that documented first and confronted later. I had built this place to protect staff from exactly this kind of pressure. Lila laughed again, a little too loudly. "This is so embarrassing," she said, glancing around. Why do you always do this to us?" "I'm not doing anything," I said, still calm. A man stepped up beside her then. Tall, confident, expensive suit. "Caleb. Lila's fiancé." He hadn't been there earlier. He looked at me once quickly, then turned his attention to the entrance. "Everything good?" he asked. Easy smile, as if he belonged in every room he entered. "Yeah," Lila said. "Just handling something." Caleb nodded, satisfied, then leaned closer to the door, speaking to someone inside through the glass. His posture was relaxed, assured. Borrowed confidence I recognized immediately. Borrowed power is always louder than the real thing. I felt the shape of the night shifting. This wasn't contained anymore. New hands were touching the story, new assumptions being made. Inside, Naomi looked up again, this time longer. She met my eyes without flinching. Then she glanced toward Daniel and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I didn't smile. I didn't move. I understood now why I hadn't interrupted earlier, why something in me had insisted on waiting. Because this wasn't just about how my family treated me. It was about what they were willing to say, what they were willing to claim, and how far they would go once they believed no one was watching. The city noise faded into the background. The music inside softened as doors closed again. The space between the glass and the sidewalk felt charged, like the pause before a storm breaks. Lila folded her arms, annoyed. "I'm calling security if you don't leave," she said. I looked past her through the glass at Daniel. He didn't move. Not yet. And in that stillness I felt certain of one thing. They had already made their choices. Now the building was listening. The shift didn't announce itself. It never does. It arrived the way a room changes temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. Conversations kept going. Glasses clinked. Music hummed softly behind the doors. But the flow at the entrance tightened, controlled in a way that hadn't been there before. Lila noticed it too. I could tell by the way she straightened, by the confidence that crept back into her shoulders. She wasn't just blocking the door anymore. She was directing it. A front desk supervisor stepped closer to the entrance from inside tablet tucked against her arm. Lila leaned toward her, immediately lowering her voice, speaking fast and certain. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught the tone, the cadence of someone who had practiced this. "We need to keep the list clean," Lila said, loud enough for me to hear the end of it. "Family requests, approved access only." The supervisor hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then she nodded. That nod landed harder than any insult. My mother appeared beside Lila a moment later, as if summoned. Margaret's expression was soft, apologetic, the face she used when she wanted to sound reasonable to people who didn't know her well. She placed a gentle hand on the supervisor's arm. "We're just trying to prevent awkward situations," she said. "You understand. It's a birthday. High-profile guests." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. I was the unspoken variable. The problem that didn't require naming. The supervisor murmured something I couldn't hear and stepped back inside. The door stayed closed. I felt something tighten low in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. Lila turned slightly, checking the reflection in the glass. Satisfied, she repositioned herself closer to the entrance, widening her stance, claiming more space. She glanced at me with a look that said, "This is handled now." Inside, Naomi had stopped typing. Her tablet rested flat on the counter, untouched. She watched the exchange without moving eyes, steady, absorbing everything. My father hovered behind Lila, arms crossed, his approval wordless but clear. He liked this version of her. Decisive, in control. He always had. Margaret leaned in again, lowering her voice further. "Ownership has already approved this," she said, casual, confident, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Ownership. The word echoed in my head, sharp and cold. That was the line. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't a misunderstanding or an emotional overreaction. It was a statement of authority that didn't belong to her, a claim made in my name without permission. The supervisor paused mid-step this time. Her posture shifted, uncertainty flickering across her face. That word carried weight here. It meant something specific. It meant documentation. I watched as she nodded again slower, then turned and walked back toward the desk. Lila exhaled triumphant. My mother finally looked at me. A brief glance, eyes cool. Not defiant, dismissive. As if to say, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I said nothing, because interrupting now would turn a record into a debate, and debates are easy to dismiss later. I noticed Naomi's fingers move again, quick and precise. She didn't look up. She didn't react. She logged. Daniel shifted position inside, a subtle change, placing himself closer to the interior side of the entrance. Not confrontational. Protective. The way he always moved when a line had been crossed and needed observation. Lila laughed louder than before, performing ease for the guests drifting past. "Everything's fine," she said brightly. "Just making sure things stay classy." Classy. I almost smiled. A couple approached the entrance, pausing when they saw the cluster of bodies. Lila stepped aside for them, smoothly ushering them in with a gracious gesture. The doors opened just long enough for me to catch the scent of citrus and polished stone. Then they closed again, shut in my face. My father leaned toward me, his voice low and irritated. "This is embarrassing," he said. "You're creating a scene." "I haven't moved," I replied. He frowned, like that fact annoyed him. Margaret touched his arm, calming him. "It's handled," she said. "Let's not escalate." Escalate. I glanced inside again. Naomi had angled her tablet slightly enough for Daniel to see. He nodded once, barely perceptible. They were listening now. Fully. I thought about the countless meetings I'd sat through where people tried to stretch authority they didn't have. The quiet confidence with which they'd made claims expecting no one to check. I'd built protocols to catch that exact behavior. Not because I distrusted people. Because I understood them. Lila's confidence grew with every minute that passed without correction. She stepped closer to the door, her shoulder almost touching the glass. "You should leave," she said to me, her voice dropping, irritation leaking through. "This is getting ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. She scoffed. "You know what I mean." Behind her, the supervisor returned to the entrance, briefly whispered something to another staff member, then moved away again. The exchange was quick, contained, but it carried weight. I felt the night tilt. Lila hadn't just spoken out of turn, she'd issued directives. Margaret hadn't just smoothed things over, she'd invoked authority. My father hadn't just stood by, he'd endorsed it. And none of them seemed to realize what they'd triggered. Naomi stepped away from the desk for the first time since I'd arrived, tablet in hand. She didn't come to the door. She moved toward the side corridor that led to administrative offices. Her pace was unhurried. Documentation didn't rush. I caught her eye as she passed through the lobby. She didn't acknowledge me directly, but there was a stillness in her gaze that told me she saw exactly what I saw. Lila turned back to my parents, smiling again, relieved. "See," she said. "It's done. Done." I looked at the glass doors, at my reflection, layered over the warm glow inside. I looked calm, collected, like someone waiting for a meeting to start. Because that's what this had become. They had spoken in my name. They had claimed my authority. They had put words into a system that never forgets. And now, without raising my voice or stepping forward, I understood something clearly. This night wasn't about whether I would be let in. It was about what would happen because they tried to keep me out. Something changed after that. Not at the door, not in my sister's voice, not in my mother's posture. It changed behind the glass in the way decisions were made without discussion. The hesitation I'd seen earlier was gone. Staff moved with quiet certainty now, like instructions had been clarified and no longer needed debate. I watched a concierge stop a guest just inside the lobby, lean in and speak softly. The guest frowned, nodded, and stepped aside to wait. A moment later, another staff member approached with a tablet, eyes focused, tone low. The exchange was brief, professional, final. No one looked at me. That was the tell. When people are uncertain, they glance toward the source of tension. When they're following a directive, they don't. They look at the record. I shifted slightly enough to catch the reflection of the tablet's screen as it angled away. My name appeared for half a second before disappearing again. Not attached to emotion. Not highlighted. Just text. I felt my stomach settle heavy and calm. They hadn't decided this at the door. They'd decided it earlier. 2 staff members passed close enough that I heard fragments of their conversation. The note on the event file, one said, "We just need confirmation." The other nodded. Already flagged. Flagged. I exhaled slowly through my nose. That word didn't belong to misunderstandings. It belonged to process. Lila didn't notice. She was too busy enjoying the ease of it now, the way people stepped around her without resistance. My father stood taller, satisfied. My mother relaxed, smoothing her jacket, scanning the crowd as if the night had finally fallen back into place. I stood exactly where I was and let the weight of it sink in. They had planned this. Not in detail, not with malice sharpened to a point, but with intent. They had anticipated my presence and prepared for it. They had used the language of the building to erase me quietly, efficiently, without ever having to face me directly. A memory surfaced, then uninvited. Years earlier, sitting across from my parents at a table that felt too small for the conversation we were trying to have. I'd explained what I was doing, the long hours, the systems I was building, the responsibility I carried. My father had listened with polite detachment. My mother had nodded, distracted. And then my father had said, "That's not a real career." Not angry, certain. That was the moment I stopped explaining myself. I'd learned then that some people don't revise their stories. They just wait for reality to get inconvenient enough to force silence. The lobby doors opened again for a group of guests, and I caught another glimpse inside. Naomi stood at the desk, posture unchanged, eyes focused. She looked up briefly, met my gaze, and then looked back down. A few seconds later, she stepped away from the desk and approached me from inside, stopping just short of the threshold. Her voice was low, careful. "There's a restriction noted for the event," she said. "No apology, no explanation, just fact. It's being reviewed." "Thank you," I replied. That was all that needed to be said. She nodded once and stepped back inside the door, closing gently between us. I could have confronted them then. I could have turned to my family and asked who put my name in a file like a liability. I could have demanded answers, watched them scramble for justification. But I didn't. Because I wanted them to stand by what they'd done. I wanted the record to be complete. Words fade. Records don't. Lila leaned toward me again, irritation flaring. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're still here." I met her eyes. "Am I not allowed to stand?" She scoffed and turned away, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "Just ignore her," she said to my parents. "She'll leave eventually." My father nodded, relieved. My mother didn't look back. Inside, the system kept working. I noticed Daniel speaking quietly to another member of security, his head tilted just enough to hear without being overheard. The other man nodded, serious. They both glanced toward the entrance, then back at their screens. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about misuse of authority, about instructions given without standing, about a family assuming proximity equaled permission. The air felt heavier, now charged with something precise and unavoidable. Guests continued to arrive, but the flow had narrowed. Access points were being managed with intention. A junior staff member near the door looked uneasy, her eyes flicking toward Lila and then away again. Pressure was building. Lila took another step forward, emboldened by compliance. "We need to hold certain people outside," she said to no one in particular. "It's getting crowded." The junior staff member hesitated, then nodded. I felt a flicker of something then. Not anger. Responsibility. This was no longer just about my exclusion. It was about staff being put in impossible positions, about my family testing how far they could stretch a system they didn't understand. I stayed silent. Because silence now wasn't patience, it was containment. Naomi reappeared at the desk, her tablet angled toward Daniel. He scanned it quickly, then looked toward the entrance. His gaze passed over my family without reaction and settled briefly on me. Just long enough to communicate something unspoken. The system had enough. I shifted my weight, feeling the cool stone beneath my heels. The city noise hummed behind me, distant and irrelevant. Everything that mattered was happening inside that glass. Lila laughed again, sharp and careless. "See," she said to my parents. "It's handled." I watched her, this sister I'd grown up protecting, now confident in a power she didn't have, unaware of the consequences already in motion. They thought they had written me out. What they had actually done was put their names into a record that couldn't be explained away later. And as I stood there calm and unmoving, I understood something with absolute certainty. The night hadn't peaked yet. It had only just become undeniable. I noticed the staff first, not the supervisors or the managers, but the younger ones, the ones still learning how to balance politeness with authority. Their shoulders were tighter now, their steps more careful. They were listening to instructions that didn't match what they'd been trained to expect, and they were trying to reconcile it without causing trouble. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back too tightly, stood near the door with her hands clasped in front of her. She glanced at Lila, then at my father, then toward the desk inside. Her eyes flicked back to me for half a second before dropping again. That look wasn't judgment. It was uncertainty. Lila mistook it for obedience. She leaned in, lowering her voice, but not enough. "We just need to keep things controlled," she said. "Ownership wants it this way." There it was again. The young staff member nodded slowly, but her fingers tightened. She shifted her weight, uncomfortable. I watched Daniel notice the exchange. He didn't interrupt. He didn't step in. He simply adjusted his stance, angling himself so he could hear without appearing to listen. That was his strength. He never rushed. He let patterns complete themselves. My mother moved closer to the door, her smile polite, reassuring. "You're doing great," she told the staff member softly. "Thank you for helping us keep the evening smooth." The staff member smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. I felt a familiar ache settle under my ribs. Not for myself, for them. I'd spent years building a culture where no one was expected to choose between courtesy and correctness, where staff didn't have to guess who held authority, where pressure like this had a clear path upward, not inward. Lila clapped her hands lightly, attention snapping back to her. "Okay, let's keep things moving," she said. "We don't want a bottleneck she'd created." Guests approached in small groups, now pausing when they saw the scene at the entrance. Some looked curious. Some looked annoyed. Lila waved them through selectively, her criteria invisible but firm. The staff followed her lead, uncertain but compliant. Each decision landed somewhere. Inside, Naomi continued to log. She didn't look stressed. She didn't look emotional. Her calm was more unnerving than anger would have been. Every time someone claimed authority, every time a staff member deferred to it, she captured it. Documentation didn't need drama. It needed consistency. I caught snippets of conversation as people passed close enough. "Is everything okay?" "Just a private event." "Interesting." My father shifted closer to Lila, pleased. He liked seeing her take charge. It reinforced his belief that she'd chosen the right path, that she fit, that I didn't. Margaret glanced at me once more, irritation flashing briefly before smoothing over. "You really should leave," she said quietly. "This isn't going to end well." I believed her. just not the way she meant it. The young staff member near the door finally spoke up, her voice hesitant. "I just need to confirm." Lila cut her off immediately. "It's already confirmed," she said, sharp now. "We've discussed this." The staff member's mouth closed. She nodded, stepping back. I saw Daniel's jaw tighten slightly. That was it. Pressure had crossed into coercion. Quiet, polite, socially acceptable coercion, but coercion all the same. The kind that makes people doubt their training and trust whoever sounds most confident. Daniel spoke into his earpiece again, low and controlled. He didn't look at anyone while he did it. A few moments later, another security officer appeared inside, positioning himself near the entrance. Not blocking, observing. Lila didn't notice. She was too busy managing her version of the night. I thought about how often systems fail because people don't want to make a scene. How many lines get crossed because no one wants to be the one who stops the flow. I'd designed this place to prevent exactly that. And now the system was doing its job. Naomi closed her tablet briefly, then reopened it. She turned the screen slightly toward Daniel, pointing to a line with her finger. He scanned it once, then nodded. No words exchanged. The young staff member caught sight of the interaction and swallowed. Relief flickered across her face, quick and quiet. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't imagined it. I wanted to tell her that, but this wasn't the moment. Lila laughed again, unaware. "See," she said to my parents. "It's fine." My father relaxed visibly, hands dropping to his sides. My mother smoothed her hair, reassured. They believed the system was on their side now. They didn't understand that systems don't take sides. They take notes. Another guest approached, stopping short when they saw the cluster. "Are we late?" the woman asked, glancing between Lila and the door. Lila smiled brightly. "Not at all," she said. "Just a moment." She turned to the staff member again, impatience creeping in. "Let them in." The staff member hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Daniel took a step closer to the door, from inside his presence unmistakable now. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The staff member looked at him, then back at Lila. "I just need confirmation from management," she said carefully. Lila's smile faltered. "Just slightly." My father frowned. "We already handled this." Daniel met the staff member's eyes and gave a small nod. She turned toward the desk inside, relief flooding her posture as she stepped away from the door. Lila's face tightened. "What is this?" she snapped. My mother reached for her arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. Inside, Naomi stood tablet in hand and began walking toward the administrative corridor again. Her steps were measured, deliberate. This wasn't an escalation. It was a correction. I felt a strange calm settle over me, deeper than anything I'd felt all night. The kind of calm that comes when you know you don't need to act anymore, when the outcome has shifted from possibility to process. Lila folded her arms, irritation turning sharp. "This is getting ridiculous," she said. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge." I almost laughed then. Almost. Because she was finally asking the right question. She just had no idea how close the answer was. The staff member returned to her position, standing straighter now. The door remained closed. Daniel adjusted his stance, ready. I stayed where I was, quiet and composed, watching my family realize piece by piece that something they couldn't charm or bully or dismiss had taken notice. They had pushed the system hard enough to make it respond. And once a system responds, it doesn't stop halfway. The night was about to change. The first real crack came when Lila raised her voice. Not a shout, not a scream. Just enough edge to cut through the ambient hum of the lobby and turn heads without her realizing she'd done it. The kind of sound people make when they're used to being obeyed and suddenly aren't. "I asked to speak to whoever's in charge," she said again, slower this time, as if volume had been the problem before. "Now." The word hung there, heavy and misplaced. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked past her, not dismissively, but professionally, scanning the entrance, the staff positions, the guests beginning to linger a little too long near the bar. He was reading the room the way surgeons read vitals. Naomi returned from the administrative corridor with a second tablet under her arm. She stopped beside Daniel, angled the screen toward him, and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "Confirmed," she said. "Multiple entries. Time-stamped." Daniel nodded once. Then he finally addressed Lila. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "we're going to need to pause entry for a moment." Lila stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "Pause entry," she repeated. "You can't do that. This is a private event." Daniel's tone didn't change. "We can," he said. "And we are." My father stepped forward, irritation flashing across his face. "This is unnecessary," he said. "There's been some confusion, but it's sorted." Daniel met his eyes politely. "Sir, at the moment, it isn't." My mother inhaled sharply. "What exactly is the issue?" she asked, forcing calm into her voice. "We were told everything was approved." Naomi finally spoke, her voice soft but precise. "There have been conflicting instructions given to staff regarding access control," she said. "We're reviewing them." Lila scoffed. "Conflicting instructions," she snapped. "From who we've been very clear." Naomi looked at her then. "Just long enough." "Exactly," she said. Silence followed. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. Behind us, a small cluster of guests pretended to check their phones while listening intently. A man near the valet slowed his pace. A woman near the bar leaned slightly closer, curiosity overcoming politeness. My mother's hand tightened around her clutch. "This is ridiculous," she said lower now. "You're making a scene." Daniel shook his head. "No, ma'am," he replied. "We're preventing one." Lila laughed, sharp and humorless. "By locking people out?" "By clarifying authority," Naomi said. That was the moment Lila turned her eyes on me again. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. But I'd become impossible to ignore. Something about the way the staff no longer looked past me, the way Daniel positioned himself slightly closer to my side than hers, had tipped her off. She looked me up and down, slow and deliberate. "This is about you, isn't it?" she said. "You did something." I met her gaze calmly. I didn't have to. My father spun toward me. "What does that mean?" he demanded. Before I could answer, a man in a dark suit stepped out from the administrative corridor behind Naomi. Older, gray at the temples, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. He didn't look at my family at first. He looked at me. "Miss Hartwell?" he said, nodding slightly. Lila froze. My mother's breath caught audibly. My father blinked. "Who?" "This is Victor Alvarez," Naomi said smoothly. "Director of Operations." Victor turned to my family, then his expression neutral. "There's been an attempt to override standard access protocol using unauthorized directives," he said. "We're investigating." Lila recovered just enough to scoff again. "Investigating us," she said. "This is absurd." Victor didn't react. "It's procedural," he replied. "In the meantime, access is temporarily restricted." "To us?" my mother asked. "To everyone," Victor corrected. "Including you." That landed. Lila's face flushed. "You can't do this," she said, voice rising again. "Do you know who we are?" Victor tilted his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "We do." He glanced at Naomi, then at Daniel. "Proceed." Daniel stepped half a pace forward, calm but unmistakable. "Miss Lila Hartwell," he said clearly, "we've documented multiple instances of staff being pressured to follow instructions outside approved channels." Lila laughed brittle. "Pressured?" I asked, politely. Daniel didn't argue. "The review will determine that." My father bristled. "This is my daughter's birthday," he said. "You're embarrassing us." Naomi met his gaze. "Sir, the documentation speaks for itself." My mother's voice dropped to a whisper aimed at me. "What did you tell them?" I shook my head slightly. "Nothing," I said. They were already listening. That was the truth. And it terrified her. Lila turned fully toward me now, eyes sharp with accusation. "You planned this," she said. "You always do." I didn't answer right away. I wanted her words to sit there exposed. "What I planned," I said finally, "was to attend your birthday." She scoffed. "You weren't invited." Victor glanced at Naomi again. Naomi nodded and tapped her tablet once. Actually, Naomi said the event booking lists no exclusion by name. The restriction was added manually this evening. Lila's mouth opened. My mother stared at her. "You did what?" Lila hesitated. "Just a fraction too long. I was just trying to keep things organized," she said quickly. "You know how she is." Everyone looked at me. I smiled faintly, not because it was funny, because it was over. Victor cleared his throat. "Until the review is complete," he said, "we'll need all parties to step back from the entrance." He looked at my family. "That includes you." My father looked between Victor and Daniel, then at the watching guests. His confidence faltered. "This is unnecessary," he muttered. Daniel's voice remained steady. "Sir, please step aside." Lila shook her head, disbelief flooding her features. "This is insane," she said. "She doesn't even belong here." Victor turned to me again. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, "would you like to proceed inside while we resolve this?" The question was simple. Neutral, professional, and devastating. My mother stared at him. "Proceed." "Inside," she repeated. Lila's laugh broke, cracking into something almost hysterical. "Why would you ask her?" Victor met her eyes at last. "Because she has clearance." The lobby went silent. I felt every gaze shift, every calculation recalibrate. Lila's mouth opened. Closed. My father's face drained of color. "Clearance," he echoed. I took a step forward, calm and unhurried. The staff member with the tight ponytail straightened instinctively, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." Daniel stepped aside, opening a clear path to the doors. I didn't walk through yet. I looked at my family instead. At some point, I said, voice level, "You were going to find out." The doors waited behind me. And for the first time all night, my family had nothing left to say. The elevator doors closed behind us with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. For a moment, no one spoke. The soft hum of ascent filled the space, broken only by the faint clink of glass from somewhere far below. Lila stood rigid beside my mother, her arms crossed too tightly, her foot tapping despite herself. My father stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if eye contact with the mirrored wall might offer him answers it hadn't yet. I stood a step away from them, hands relaxed at my sides. The distance was deliberate, not physical, emotional. "You didn't have to do that," my mother said at last, her voice low and controlled. "Not like this." I didn't turn to her. Like what I asked, by letting things play out the way they were already going. She exhaled sharply. "You know exactly what I mean." The elevator chimed softly as we passed another floor. Lila let out a short laugh, brittle and humorless. "So what is this?" she said. "Some kind of lesson. You make us look stupid in front of everyone, and now you're satisfied." I met her eyes in the reflection. "I didn't make you do anything." My father finally looked at me. "Are you enjoying this?" he asked. "Is that what this is about?" The question stung more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was familiar. It was the same question he'd asked years ago when I told him I was leaving the firm he'd helped me get into. The same tone. The same assumption that if I wasn't following his script, I must be rebelling for attention. "No," I said. "I'm tired." That shut him up. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors slid open to the skyline level, revealing soft lighting, muted tones, and a quiet efficiency that hummed beneath the elegance. Staff members glanced up, recognition immediate posture shifting subtly as we stepped out. "Good evening," a hostess said to me, warm and composed. "We're ready whenever you are." Lila's breath caught. My mother's hand tightened around her purse again, knuckles pale. I nodded. Thank you. We moved forward as a group, though it felt more like gravity pulling us in different directions. The dining room beyond was already alive. Low laughter, crystal catching light. The murmur of money and influence wrapped in polite conversation. This was the room my family had been so desperate to control. A server approached with a tray of champagne flutes, pausing instinctively in front of me first. "Would you like one?" she asked. I declined with a small shake of my head. Not yet. Lila watched the exchange like it was happening underwater. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, since when I stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Since before tonight," I said. "Since long before you decided I didn't belong." My father stepped between us slightly, instinct kicking in. "Enough," he said. "We're here to celebrate." "Are we?" I asked. "Or are we here to pretend nothing happened?" My mother's eyes flicked around the room, scanning faces. "This isn't the place," she whispered. "People are watching." "They were watching downstairs too," I replied. "You didn't seem concerned then." She flinched. We reached the table. Lila's name card sat front and center, ornate and bold. Mine was placed quietly at the head. That was the moment something in her broke. "This is humiliating," she hissed. "You planned this. You took my night." I didn't raise my voice. "You tried to lock me out of a building I own." The words landed between us solid and undeniable. My father's face shifted confusion, giving way to something closer to understanding. "Own," he repeated slowly. I met his gaze. "Yes." The silence stretched. My mother swallowed. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, almost pleading now. I pulled out my chair and sat down, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "I tried," I said. "Years ago. You told me it wasn't real work. That hospitality was beneath me. So I stopped explaining." Lila shook her head. "This can't be right." "It is," I said. "And tonight isn't about proving it." A server arrived with menus, placing mine down with a nod of familiarity. Another approached to quietly ask about timing preferences. The machine moved smoothly, professionally, indifferent to family drama. My father lowered himself into his chair slower now. "How long?" he asked. "A while," I answered. He stared at the tablecloth, then let out a breath. "I didn't know." "No," I said. "You didn't ask." Across the room, a man in a tailored suit caught my eye and inclined his head politely. I returned the gesture without thinking. Lila noticed. "Who was that?" she asked sharply. "Someone who leases 3 floors," I replied. Her mouth opened then closed. Dinner was served in courses, each one arriving with quiet precision. Conversation around us resumed in fits and starts, my family speaking, less, listening more. Lila pushed her food around her plate, appetite gone. My mother smiled too brightly at anyone who looked our way, trying to stitch normalcy back together. Halfway through the main course, I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim envelope. Lila noticed immediately. "What's that?" I placed it gently on the table, sliding it toward her. "Your gift." She stared at it, suspicion warring with curiosity. "What kind of trick is this?" "No trick," I said. "Open it." My father leaned in despite himself. My mother's breath caught again. Lila tore the envelope open, scanning the document inside, her face drained of color. "This is a deed," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "A property outside Santa Barbara. It's in your name." Her eyes snapped up to mine. "Why?" "Because you're my sister," I said. "And because I won't let bitterness decide who I become." The table went silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was stunned. My father looked between us, emotion flickering across his face. "You're giving this to her," he said. "After everything." "Yes." My mother's voice trembled. You didn't have to. I know I said. I chose to. Lila sat back slowly, the fight draining out of her. For the first time all night, she looked unsure rather than angry. But I continued, meeting all of their eyes. Now this doesn't reset anything. Boundaries are still boundaries. My father nodded faintly. My mother swallowed hard. If you want anything connected to my work, I said you go through proper channels. No favors, no pressure, no pretending authority you don't have. Lila said nothing. I stood smoothing my dress again. Enjoy the rest of your party. I left them there, the gift between them, like a mirror they hadn't asked to look into. As I walked toward the terrace doors, the city lights stretched out before me, endless and indifferent. The air outside was cooler, cleaner. I breathed it in slowly. For the first time that night, my shoulders relaxed. I hadn't come to punish them. I'd come to stop shrinking. And that was something no one could take away from me again. I stayed on the terrace longer than I meant to. Not because I was hiding and not because I was afraid to go back inside. It was because the city below felt honest in a way people rarely are. Lights didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. They didn't apologize for existing. They didn't shrink themselves to make others comfortable. The doors behind me slid open softly. I didn't turn right away, but I knew who it was from the sound of the steps. My father had a particular way of walking when he was unsure, slower than usual, like each step needed permission. You always liked heights, he said. I let out a quiet breath. I liked distance. He came to stand beside me, resting his hands on the railing. For a moment, we just looked out at the skyline together, the space between us filled with everything we hadn't said for years. I didn't know, he said again, softer this time. Not really. I know, I replied. That's the problem. He flinched but didn't argue. When you left, he continued, I thought you were being stubborn, that you'd come back once you realized how hard the real world is. I nodded slowly. It was hard, just not in the way you expected. He looked at me, then really looked like he was trying to match the woman beside him with the version of me he'd frozen in his mind years ago. You built all this, he said quietly. Yes. By yourself, not alone, I corrected. But without you. The words weren't meant to punish him. They were simply true. He swallowed. Your mother. She worries about image, about appearances. You know that. I do, I said. That's why I stopped trying to fit into hers. He leaned heavier against the railing. Tonight got out of hand. It did, I agreed. But it didn't start tonight. He nodded reluctantly. I let things go, I continued, for years. I stayed quiet because I thought that was the price of peace. But silence didn't make things better. It just taught everyone they could decide who I was without consequences. He didn't interrupt. That alone felt like progress. I'm not asking you to choose sides, I said. I'm asking you to see me clearly. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of laughter from inside. A reminder that the party was still happening, even if something fundamental had already changed. I see you, he said at last. I just didn't want to admit how wrong I was. I looked at him, then really looked, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small standing next to him. That's all I needed, I said. We stood there a moment longer before I excused myself and went back inside, not to the table, but to the executive corridor beyond the dining room. The place where decisions lived, where feelings didn't get to vote. Naomi was already there, tablet in hand. Everything all right? She asked. Yes, I said, and we need to document the rest. She nodded without hesitation. Over the next hour, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Incident reports were logged, timestamps attached, statements recorded calmly without judgment. No raised voices, no accusations, just facts. Lila tried once to intervene, pulling a staff member aside with a familiar smile and a promise of gratitude later. It didn't work. The staff member redirected her politely and notified Naomi immediately. That was new for her. My mother attempted a different approach, lowering her voice, invoking family embarrassment future favors. Naomi listened respectfully, then reminded her of protocol. There were no confrontations, no scenes, just doors that didn't open when they weren't supposed to. Across the room, I noticed conversations shifting. Guests who had been orbiting my sister earlier now found reasons to speak to me instead. Not dramatically, casually. The way power recognizes power without needing an introduction. One man mentioned leasing interest. A woman asked about expansion plans. Another congratulated me on a recent opening I hadn't announced publicly. Lila watched all of it from the edge of the room, confusion giving way to something sharper. Not anger, fear. Because for the first time the story she'd been telling wasn't working. At one point she approached me near the bar, her voice low. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I didn't," I replied. "I chose not to stop it." She folded her arms. "You made me look like a liar." "No," I said gently. "I let people hear you." She stared at me, searching for the cruelty she expected to find. When she didn't, her shoulders slumped. "This was supposed to be my night," she muttered. I nodded. "It still is. What happens after is up to you." She didn't respond. Later, as guests began to thin and the energy softened, my mother found me near the entrance to the corridor. Her expression was careful, practiced. "You could say something," she said. "Just a few words. Smooth things over." I met her eyes. "For who?" "For your sister," she said. "For the family." "I already did," I replied, "by not humiliating anyone." She frowned. "People will talk." "They already are," I said. "The difference is they're talking about the truth." She sighed, the weight of the evening settling into her posture. "You've changed." "I considered that." "No," I said. I stopped pretending. That was the last real conversation we had that night. By the time the final guests left and the staff began their quiet reset, the building felt like it always did after something important. Calm, orderly, unimpressed by human drama. I walked back toward the front doors alone, the same doors I'd been blocked from hours earlier. They opened smoothly now, light spilling out onto the pavement. No hesitation, no scrutiny. Just access. I paused there for a moment, hand resting lightly on the frame. This wasn't victory. It was correction. And as I stepped out into the night, I understood something I hadn't before. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause. It just keeps working quietly until the truth becomes unavoidable. Tonight wasn't the end. It was the point where everything finally aligned. The morning after felt quieter than it should have. Not peaceful, just stripped down. Like a room after the guests leave and the music stops when you can finally hear what was always there underneath. I arrived at the hotel earlier than usual. No announcement, no entourage. Just me and the building the way it existed before anyone decided it was a stage. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and stone polish. Overnight reports sat waiting in my inbox, neat and unemotional. Timestamps, names, language used, attempts logged. Everything my family tried to turn into whispers had become records. Naomi met me near the executive corridor, tablet already in hand. "Good morning," she said. "I've compiled the incident summary." I nodded. "Let's go through it." We didn't rush. That mattered. Rushing makes things feel reactive. And this wasn't reaction. This was follow-through. The report was clean. Lila's instructions to staff were documented precisely. My mother's attempts to override protocol were noted without commentary. No adjectives, no assumptions, just actions. "Any escalation?" I asked. Naomi hesitated for half a second. "One." She pulled up a separate file. There were follow-up messages sent late last night. "From who?" She turned the screen toward me. My sister's name sat at the top. I exhaled slowly. What did she try? She contacted 2 department heads directly, Naomi said, framed it as damage control, asked if notes could be amended to avoid misunderstandings. And Naomi's mouth curved into the faintest smile. They forwarded everything to legal. Good. We moved into the conference room overlooking the city. Sunlight cut across the table in sharp lines, revealing nothing to hide behind. Legal joined remotely. Operations dialed in from another time zone. The machine clicked into motion the way it always did when clarity replaced emotion. No one mentioned family. That also mattered. By mid-morning, decisions were finalized. Not punishments. Adjustments. My sister's access to any internal channels was formally revoked. Temporary, but firm. My mother's pending requests tied to the property were frozen under standard review. No explanations issued. No confrontations required. The system spoke. Quietly. Completely. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Dad. I let it ring twice before answering. Can we talk? He asked. Yes, I said. But not here. We met later at a cafe a few blocks away. Neutral ground, no chandeliers, no staff trained to defer. Just tables, sunlight, and people who didn't know our last name. He arrived early, sat with his hands wrapped around a coffee he hadn't touched. I didn't sleep, he said. I did, I replied. He winced. That figures. We sat in silence for a moment. He looked older in daylight, less certain. Your mother's upset, he said carefully. I know. And your sister, I know. I repeated. He sighed. They feel blindsided. I tilted my head. By what? He didn't answer right away. By consequences, I continued. By being told no. By the fact that the world didn't bend to keep their story intact. That's not fair, he said automatically, then stopped himself. Maybe it is. I watched him wrestle with that. It wasn't my job to make it easier. I don't want to lose you, he said finally. I held his gaze. Then don't ask me to disappear so things stay comfortable. His shoulders sagged. I didn't realize that's what we were doing. I did, I said. That's why I stopped coming around. He nodded slowly. I'm trying to understand. That's all I'm asking, I said. Not approval, not apologies. Understanding. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. The deed, the one I'd given Lila. She doesn't know if she can accept it, he said. That's her choice, I replied. She thinks it makes her look small. I smiled faintly. It doesn't. Refusing it to save pride might. He studied me. You've thought this through. For years, I said. We finished our coffee without resolution, but without hostility. That was enough for now. Back at the hotel, the afternoon unfolded like any other. Meetings, calls, decisions that had nothing to do with family drama and everything to do with running a business built on consistency. A regional director called to confirm expansion timelines. A vendor asked for approval on revised terms. I said yes to some things, no to others. No one argued. That evening, as the sun dropped low enough to turn the glass outside gold, Naomi stopped by again. One more thing, she said. Your sister came by earlier. I raised an eyebrow. Here. She stayed in the lobby, Naomi clarified. Didn't ask for access. Just watched. I considered that. Did she say anything? No. Good, I said. That means she's learning. Naomi hesitated. Do you want me to send a message? Clarify boundaries. I shook my head. They're already clear. As the building shifted into evening mode, staff moving with their familiar precision, I took a moment alone in my office. I looked out over the city, the same view that had once felt like a distant dream and now felt like responsibility. I hadn't won anything. I'd simply stopped losing. Family blindness doesn't end in a single night. It fades slowly, if at all, when people are forced to confront the gap between who they thought you were and who you actually became. Some people cross that gap. Some don't. I turned back to my desk and opened the next report. Life moved forward. And this time I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to let it. A week passed before my sister finally spoke to me. Not a text. Not a call. She showed up. I was reviewing staffing projections when Naomi knocked once and stepped inside. "She's here," she said. "No name needed." Where I asked. "The public lounge," Naomi replied. "She asked to see you. Didn't push." That detail mattered. "Give us the space," I said. "And thank you." Lila was standing by the windows when I arrived, hands clasped tightly in front of her, posture stiff in a way that felt unfamiliar. She wasn't dressed for performance this time. No dramatic silhouette, no strategic heels, just neutral, almost careful. She turned when she heard me. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. "I didn't sit. I didn't gesture for her to sit either." I leaned lightly against the table across from her, leaving the choice to her. "You could have called," I said. She nodded. I didn't trust myself not to say something stupid. That almost made me smile. We stood there in silence, the city humming below us. This was a different room than the one she'd tried to control. No guest list, no audience. "I'm angry," she said finally, and embarrassed, and confused. "Those things can exist together," I replied. She looked at me, then really looked. "Why didn't you stop it?" she asked. "When it started going wrong." "You could have," I answered honestly, "because it wasn't wrong to let people see the truth." Her jaw tightened. "You let me fail." "No," I said. "You chose to." That landed hard. She flinched but didn't lash out. I thought she said slowly, "If I controlled the night, everything else would fall into place. The people, the deals. Mom said it mattered." "She wasn't wrong," I said. "It mattered to her." Lila's voice dropped. "And to Dad?" "Yes," she exhaled sharply. "I've spent my whole life trying to be impressive enough that no one would look too closely." I crossed my arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "That's exhausting." Her shoulders sagged. "You always made it look easy." I shook my head. "I made it quiet." That surprised her. "You didn't see the years no one returned my calls?" I continued. "The nights I slept in offices. The meetings where people assumed I was the assistant." She laughed softly, bitter. "That happened to me once. I lost it." "I swallowed it," I said, and kept going. She studied the floor. "I didn't think hospitality was real power." "It isn't," I said. "It's real responsibility." She nodded, absorbing that. "What happens now?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. "That depends," I said, "on what you want." She looked up sharply. "I don't want to compete with you. I never asked you to." "I don't want to pretend anymore," she added. "I don't want Mom speaking for me, or Dad excusing me." I held her gaze. "Then stop letting them." Silence again. Different this time. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. The deed. Edges slightly worn now. "I haven't signed it," she said. "I needed to understand why you gave it to me." "Do you?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Because you didn't want to win. You wanted it to end." "Yes." Her eyes filled just a little. She blinked it away quickly. "I don't deserve it." I shrugged. "That's not how gifts work." She let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was real. I believe you," I said. She straightened slightly, like the weight had shifted. "Mom's furious," she said. "She says you're punishing her." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm just not protecting her from herself anymore." "And Dad?" "He's trying," I said, "in his way." Lila nodded. He asked me who I wanted to be when no one was watching. That surprised me. "What did you say?" I didn't answer, she admitted. "But I'm thinking about it." That was enough. When she left, she didn't hug me. She didn't promise anything, but she didn't posture either. Later that night, my mother called. I let it ring longer than necessary before answering. "You're tearing this family apart," she said immediately. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm refusing to hold it together by myself." "You're punishing us for caring," she insisted. "For controlling," I corrected. She scoffed. "You think you're better than us now." I closed my eyes briefly. "I think I'm done negotiating my worth." There was a long pause on the line. "Lila spoke to you," she said. "Yes." And we talked," I replied. "Without you." Her breath hitched. "You're freezing me out." "No," I said. "I'm inviting you to meet me without manipulation." "That's not fair," she snapped. "It's honest," I replied. She hung up. I didn't call back. The following days settled into something new. Not peace, not war, clarity. My father texted occasionally. Neutral updates. Careful questions. No demands. My sister signed the deed 2 days later. My mother stayed silent. At work, nothing faltered. If anything, the air felt cleaner. Staff moved with confidence. Decisions landed without friction. One afternoon, Naomi paused at my door. "I've never seen boundaries hold like that," she said. "They're easier to enforce when you mean them," I replied. That night, alone in my office, I looked out over the city again. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned, and I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge isn't the moment you're proven right. It's the moment you stop needing to be. The night the city finally felt quiet again, I stayed late. Not because there was more work to do, but because some endings need space. The building had settled into its after-hours rhythm, lights dimmed to a softer glow, footsteps rare and unhurried. From my office window, the skyline stretched out like a held breath finally released. I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I had raised my voice, if I had demanded apologies, if I had used power the way my family used shame, it would have been louder, messier, shorter, and it would have changed nothing. My phone buzzed once on the desk, a message from my sister. "I signed the papers today." "Thank you. I'm not sure what comes next, but I'm trying to figure it out on my own." I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then typed back. "That's all I ever wanted for you." No lecture, no advice, just truth. I didn't hear from my mother that week, or the next. At first, the silence felt pointed like a punishment. Then it softened into something else. Distance isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's a boundary learning how to exist. My father came by the hotel one afternoon unannounced. Not to the skyline level, not to the executive suite. He waited in the lobby like everyone else. When Naomi told me, I paused, then said, "Send him up." He looked smaller when he stepped into my office. Not weaker, just human. "I wanted to see it," he said, gesturing around. "Without the noise." I nodded. "Now you are." He walked slowly, touching the edge of a table, studying the view. "You built something real," he said. I was wrong about that. I didn't rush to respond. "I don't need you to punish yourself," I said finally. "I needed you to stop dismissing me." He swallowed. "I see that now." We talked for an hour. Not about blame. About time. About choices. About how easy it is to confuse control with care. When he left, it wasn't fixed. But it was honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the only foundation that holds. Weeks passed. The incident faded into routine. The reports were archived. The gossip moved on to newer scandals. That's how systems work. They absorb shock, then keep moving. So did I. The hotel hosted another private event not long after. Different faces, different energy, same standards. I walked through the lobby unnoticed, just another woman in a tailored coat. And for the first time, I smiled at that. I didn't need to be recognized to belong. Belonging came from knowing who I was, even when no one else did. One evening, as I locked up and headed toward the doors, I caught my reflection in the glass. Not the version my family froze years ago. Not the one they were comfortable underestimating. This one stood straight, calm, unapologetic. Family blindness hurts because it teaches you to doubt your own worth. It convinces you that love is conditional, that approval must be earned, that silence is safer than truth. But silence only delays the reckoning. I didn't tell this story because I won. I told it because I stopped shrinking. Because I let systems boundaries and quiet consistency do what arguments never could. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear me clearly. Being dismissed doesn't mean you're small. Being excluded doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it just means the people around you are measuring life with tools that were never meant to recognize your kind of strength. You don't need to scream to be powerful. You don't need revenge to reclaim your dignity. Sometimes the most complete payback is simply building a life so solid that no one can pretend it doesn't exist. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever felt invisible at a table where you should have mattered, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments or tell me where you're listening from. These stories feel lighter when they're shared. And if you want to stay here for more stories about quiet strength, hard boundaries, and truth that speaks for itself, consider subscribing. Not because of numbers, but because spaces like this only exist when people choose honesty over noise. Thank you for listening all the way through. Wherever you are, whatever you're building while others doubt you, keep going. One day you won't need to explain yourself, you'll simply walk through the door,